Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. This is really exciting. Welcome to everyone. Um, just a few housekeeping notes. Everybody's going to be really brief. We talked too much last time. It was a lot of passion involved. But if the whole program is going to be muted, if you have any questions, if you're familiar with Zoom, could you chat them? And we have two people that are going to keep all the questions because we're going to have a question and answer session, which should be really fabulous. And if you don't Zoom, just write them down, and we'll get around to them during the question and answer section. Um, my favorite commercial in the world is simply that commercial that says, "We are the people of the United Methodist Church. Welcome."
Right.
Okay, you got to be quiet. Okay.
Lord knows what
You got to be quiet.
what's going on.
Okay, and we're going to start our litany. God of light, God of change, you fashion each of us in your image, reflecting the presence of your spirit and fullness of your grace. You call us into being as whole persons. You call us into community to be one in you. Yet too often we choose to see others as less than ourselves because of the color of their skin.
Light of
Light
God,
of God,
transfigure us that we may
that we
live
may live
as
one.
one.
You invite us into right relationship with you. You invite us to love you whom we have not seen. But how can we love you when we are unable to love those we see? How can we love you when we cannot love those who are clear reflections of you?
Light of
Light
God,
of God,
transfigure us that we may mirror you.
We are one in you, O God, who created us all. We are all sisters and brothers, walking in the light of your love. Help us to love our neighbors even more than we love ourselves.
Light of God, transfigure us that we may love each other.
Your spirit dwells among us, giving us all freedom. Yet too often we succumb to the sin of racism. Forgive us for attitudes of superiority which result in oppression. Forgive us for binding others within structures of racism and injustice, and so abandoning your beloved ones to a wilderness of degradation.
Light of God, transfigure us that we may be vessels of freedom.
We look around the world and witness the economic injustices of facing people of color. Too often we stand idly by men, women, and children you created that are left to die without food, without shelter, and without health care.
Light of God, transfigure us that we may work for justice.
Forgive us for daring to think we are better than others. Forgive us for not seeing your face reflected in the faces of all humankind. Forgive us for not living your commandment to love each other.
Light of God, transfigure us that we may reflect your truth.
And what is a few words?
All around us we see, hear, speak, taste, and feel the fear and hatred that are the roots of racism. Provide us with the courage to care, the vision to imagine a newer relationship, the wisdom to speak out, and the passion to stand up and be heard in our protests and cries for freedom.
Light of God, transfigure us that we may be instruments of change.
Open our hearts and lives to your transforming light. Open our mouths to speak the truth on behalf of people of color who continue to be marginalized by the many facets of racism.
Light of God, transfigure us from one degree of glory to another.
God of light, God of change, open our hearts and minds to embrace the equality and justice for all people around the world. Create us in the desire to bring change in our world. Unveil our hearts so that your light may shine through us.
Light of God, transfigure us. There is yet more of your light and truth to break forth from among us.
Leah, will you pray for us?
Yes, I absolutely will. I apologize. I lost my place in the agenda, so I apologize. Good evening, everyone. And I too, as Ivy said, am excited to be with you today. But I have to admit, as I say most days, it's one of those days. It's a day when I am tired, I'm anxious, I'm overwhelmed by everything that I see around. And I'm a pastor at Lynn and Cini United Methodist Church in East Knoxville. And where I am in ministry, you see people all around who are ill, and people who are mourning, people who have died or who are ill, people who are facing economic uncertainty, people who are devastated by the divisions and the inequalities, and particularly in East Knoxville these days, the violence that's going on that's been infecting our community. So it's been an overwhelming, and so as I prepare to pray tonight, I selected a prayer of hope to give us some hope as we begin our time together tonight. And so let us pray. Beloved God, we give you thanks for the life and for the message of Jesus, the one who remains our guide and our inspiration and our promise of hope these times. For Jesus is the one who calls us to love in a time of indifference, calls us to nonviolence in a time of injustice, and calls us to life in a time of death. In Jesus, we are able to meet you, oh God, and we see your true face. And from now on, we know that you are not a God of despair, but a God of hope. We know that you are not a God of wrath, but of mercy. You are not a God of condemnation, but of compassion. You're not a God of imperial power, but of suffering. You're not a God of domination, but of loving service. You're not a God of oppression, but a God of liberation. You're not a God who blesses injustice, but the God who gives justice. Not a God of war, but a God of peace. Not a God of violence, but a God of nonviolence. Not a God of death, but a God of life. From now on, we know that we have all been created to share in that fullness of life, to share in your love, and to share in your unending mercy. As we step forward into the future, as we support each other, as we seek to build community, not just tonight, but when we leave tonight, be with us. Let people know that we have met Jesus, that Jesus is alive and goes before us, and that Jesus is summoning us to a mission, a vision of racial equity that is possible in God. We have been changed forever, oh God, because of you. And our hearts burn with the fire of hope in you. Amen.
Thank you, Leah.
Mhm.
We are so glad that you've joined us tonight. I'm going to share a little bit about the details of the evening. Next, we're going to hear from Reverend Brenda Carroll. She's going to share a story with us. And after that, there'll be a time of questions that you may ask her about her story. We're also going to have some time for discussion about the white privilege checklist that you received and some other questions or comments you might have from last week. Then we will have the honor of hearing from Reverend Tony Love and Bishop Ken Carter, two important and committed voices in our United Methodist Church. We are most grateful that they could be with us tonight, and we will definitely have time for discussion. We do plan to focus for a little while tonight on what is known as white privilege. Many are turned off just hearing the words because they do not believe themselves to be privileged. This privilege we are speaking of is not whether you have wealth, but whether that things in your life have not been made more difficult because of your skin color. Becoming aware of one's own privilege should not be viewed as a burden or a source of guilt, but rather an opportunity to learn and to be responsible, so we may work toward a more just and inclusive world. Pointing out that white privilege exists isn't the same as accusing every white person of being racist. We will talk more about this in a few minutes, but we ask that everyone be open to discussion. And let's remember that talking about these things are difficult, but it's something we must do. And we want to talk about how privilege affects every single one of us. As we work on understanding and coming to terms with our privilege, let's remember why we have it in the first place. We must understand and acknowledge our history. When enslaved people began to arrive in this country, everything had been taken from them, their homes, their country, their culture, their families, everything. But here they had Jesus, who no one could take from them. As James Baldwin, the famed author, wrote, how remarkable it was for enslaved people to accept Jesus when many came over here on a ship called the Good Ship Jesus. Think about it. Christianity, Jesus, here looked like a white person. Here we promoted the worship of a God who looked nothing like them but bore the image of their white oppressors. It associated all that was good with white skin. So imagine that in the face of this religion that taught them to be subservient, less than, they knew the real Jesus. The Jesus who comforted them in the midst of unspeakable cruelty. The Jesus who loved them as children of God. Howard Thurman's grandmother, who was an enslaved person on a plantation, listened to a black preacher tell her over and over, you are not the N-word. You are not a slave. You are a child of God. She constantly reminded Thurman of this, and he never forgot his grandmother's words. This is the Jesus we follow, the Jesus who calls us to be the church of Oct and to live by his example. So let's follow the Jesus of the enslaved. Let's do this hard work of confronting our past, accepting that we do indeed have privilege, and then let's figure out what we can do to become anti-racist, and then let's do it. Brenda?
When I first began hearing the word white privilege, I knew that word had nothing to do with me. Not long ago, a friend of mine, a Facebook friend, put on Facebook that she was tired of hearing the white privilege thing. And she then began to tell how hard her parents had worked for everything they had, how hard they'd worked to put her through college, and how hard she had worked for everything she had. And you don't get into a discussion about that. I couldn't try to bring any insight to that on Facebook, but I understood where she was coming from because I've been there too. I grew up in, as I shared last week, in Russell County. I lived on a corporate farm that had, in previous times, a previous century, been a plantation. And the big house, as we were taught to call it, the mansion, the antebellum mansion, was built by slaves. The bricks were made by slaves. This was a story that I grew up hearing, and the residents of that antebellum mansion in my lifetime were State Senator Harry Stewart, and he loved to show off the picture of General J.E.B. Stewart, his ancestor, that was a life-size portrait in his house. They were white privilege, as I understood the term when I began to hear it. They were white privilege and I was white poor. My dad was a farmhand, a hireling on their hundreds of acres, and we made it possible for him to be off in Richmond all the time, being a state senator, and their home was one in which there were servants. We grew up, my house was in the shadow of that house and was a very different kind of house. So white privilege, I never understood myself to be privileged in comparison to that. And in comparison to most of the people I grew up with were children of landowners. I was not. My family owned pretty much nothing. So when I would hear the term white privilege and it was said that I had white privilege, it set up a tension within me. And I listened to on the General Commission on Religion and Race website, I listened to Robin DiAngelo give a lecture on white privilege. And I found myself in that lecture. Lo and behold, I do have white privilege. I learned, as Pat said, that it's not about economics. No, I was not economically privileged. I was just very fortunate to attend college in a time where the college funds that were granted to me were matched by a government program. That's the only reason I had a college education. It was all gift. I was not privileged enough to go to college, not economically privileged enough. So I began to wrestle with helping my own internal self accept that I was a part of white privilege. And I understood it from two standpoints. I had two bridges into the concept of white privilege that I was a part of, that identified me also. White privilege had to do with the reality that my skin's the color of the dominant group. Now, when I went to seminary, I learned something about male privilege too. The job that I was promised didn't exist, and I went to the office of the lady who had promised it, and what she had was an index card box, and she would go through and she would say, no, they won't take a woman in that job. No, they won't take a woman in that job. And I started a journey that helped me to begin to understand that anytime I walked into a pulpit, there were going to be people who questioned my worthiness and my right to be there simply because I was a woman, not because of knowing me or hearing me or anything that had to do with any kind of acquaintance, but it was evaluated on my gender. That was a bridge for me to understand that all of my friends and colleagues who are not white, every day of their lives are evaluated by the color of their skin. That there are places that I can go that doors are wide open and where they have to work their way in. There are things that are given to me that are denied to them simply because of the colors of my skin, their skin. And I'm thankful for Robin DiAngelo and the book then that I read, White Fragility, and began to see myself all through that book, and how blind I had been to some of these concepts throughout my life. So what a blessing it is to begin to open up, to understand the dynamics that exist. Even though I didn't help create them, I have had the privilege. It's not a privilege I celebrate, but it's a privilege I have to recognize of living within that set of standards, or as the book that I recently read, the caste system. I'm in the caste of persons with white skin, and that has given me some open doors, some privileges, some places of acceptance that others who have a different color of skin simply do not have. And so thank God that we do get the opportunity to grow and learn and understand things in a different way throughout our lives, and that journey of coming to open-mindedness and understanding does not ever end. It hasn't for me, and I hope it hasn't for you.
Thank you, Brenda, for sharing, being so open and honest about white privilege and what it's meant to you and in your life. Hello, everyone. I want to open up with, first of all, I want to ask, or I guess suggest, there was a survey or a questionnaire that we had sent out along with the Zoom link for this week's session, and it was a checklist. So we will discuss that a little later, I do believe, but I want to make sure everyone had access to that, and I think it'll be put up also at some point in time that way we can discuss it. Before I get started with a little discussion, does anyone have questions for Brenda that they would like to ask? Okay, maybe later. If so, just put it in the chat. For those of you that were with us last week, would anyone like to share with those of us tonight anything that you shared, or any discussions that you may have had in the chat rooms, or any questions from last week's session? The floor is yours. None? Okay, well, I'll ask a few questions. Did anyone intentionally try to have or engage in a conversation about race this week with anyone? Don't be shy. and these questions are for anyone. So if we're all here, it's a safe space. So I don't want anyone to feel as though they can't ask a question or that their responses would be inappropriate, because it's a safe space. That's one of the things that we try to attain within our sessions and our group, because we're all learning. Like Brenda said, it's ongoing.
Miss Stephanie,
Yes.
I have a really good friend who is in a different denomination, but she moved from Texas to Arkansas. And I don't know if any of you saw that video about the most racist town in America. Well, apparently it's Harrison, Arkansas. And my friend is a beautiful, tall, learned Reverend Doctor, African-American woman, Black woman. And she went out and visited them and saw it was going to be obviously like a cross-cultural situation. And they were really excited to have her come. And she was kind of fighting a little bit. How didn't, I can respect that. And they made her an offer she couldn't refuse. So she went, she accepted one day, and the very next day her daughter sent her a video basically called Harrison, Arkansas, the most racist town in America. So she's been very well received and beloved, and has been there, I think it's about 7 weeks now. And she's had 3 journalists come and interview her and take video of her being called to this place. And the last one, he was from Sweden. So it's kind of interesting. It's attracting a lot of attention, but she says, I'm just done with this Black woman. It gets assigned to the most racist town in America. So she's kind of, but anyway, so we check in a bit. She's one of my best friends. So I just thought I'd share that little scenario with the group.
Awesome. She's made a bold move. A very bold move.
She states very clearly that God called her to be there. She's also a missionary, so it certainly has kind of a mission tone to it for her. Yeah, it was bold. She's very brave, very bold.
Yes. But we will definitely be praying. I know I will, for her safety, and that God uses her, because that's her heart. It sounds like her heart. So, and He uses us. He does.
Well, it blows my mind. I mean, because I wouldn't know what that's like. I mean, and then I guess gets back to the white privilege thing. So, anyways.
Well, thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Sure.
Anyone else have anything to say, or any questions about what we just heard?
Hi, this is Brenda. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I had a conversation with a coworker who says she is not prejudiced in any way, yet she has 2 nieces and a nephew who are biracial. She cannot verbalize that. She does not accept that she has had privilege just because she is white. And the more she's spoken, I see and work with this woman every day. I didn't realize I had so much unaddressed anger in myself that I never even noticed it before I made the attempt to have the conversation with someone about it. And so I just wanted to state that denial and anger are on all parties, and that we have to receive where we are, especially in this time.
Absolutely. And as Pat said earlier, and a few You know, that's one of the, it's not easy to say I'm privileged. I can imagine that's not, because once you acknowledge, you know, I always think of it as in, you know, learnings or the teachings of Jesus Christ. You know, we can say we love Christ and that we're a Christian, but until we get to have that relationship, that's when we begin to change and grow. And I think that's happened with, you know, with white privilege. If you acknowledge it, you might change. If you acknowledge it, you might have to do something different. And I think there's a fear there, because what has always been, you know, change isn't easy. But that's just from my perspective. Does anyone else want to speak to that?
I am going to address it because Stephanie and Stephanie is a young woman that is leading this section, and Stephanie and I talk about this all the time. Stephanie is in her early 40s and I am 60. And the difference between our two generations is the ability to be able, I feel like I'm from the suck it up and take it section of town. And Stephanie is from the section that just puts it out there. So that was my sister that said she was angry. And Stephanie, you can reiterate for me that she needs to get over it and stop sucking it up.
Oh, thank you, Ivy. Why do I have a question I'll just put out to you all. And Pat, if I get close to end time, you know, to chime in. Why do white people have such a hard time accepting that they have privilege or advantage? What do you think about that?
I think it's just like what Brenda said, that you don't, you have a different idea of what it is. You think white privilege is money, economics, you know, big house, big car, all that, but you're not in even in the general part of what it really is until you realize what it really is. And it's not money or economics or being the big dog. It's about who you are. I mean, your color of your skin and the fact that you are not Emmett Till. If you had whistled at a white woman, you wouldn't be dead today, perhaps. Well, unless you were older. I mean, you know, under the circumstances. Yes. Let's put it like that. Yes. But just because, you know, you did an act that would seem like a normal thing to do, you would not have died for it if you had been white.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. That seems to be, these days and times, the flow of things. That, you know, and I say that a lot. I find myself saying that, well, if so-and-so was African American, if they're black, would that have happened? What would, you know, and trying to figure out those different scenarios, it just overwhelms me. And I have to bring myself back because you have to wonder.
To address your question, can you hear me all right? This is Lloyd.
Yes.
From a spiritual perspective, the idea of white privilege and the idea of white male privilege, to me, comes back to the temptations of Jesus. Yeah. He is tempted by the adversary about things like security and comfort, power and control, and acclamation. And so as a white male, I am always cognizant of the fact that whatever racist, whatever ism that starts to bubble up in me really comes from succumbing to those particular temptations. I like having security and comfort. I like having power and control. I like having acclamation or affirmation. So I see this as a deeply rooted spiritual problem that is evidenced or is modeled by our Lord and Savior in the wilderness of temptation. If I don't succumb to those isms in me, then there's a chance that I lose a little security and a little comfort, a little power and a little control, and a lot of acclamation. So it's inherently, I think, just part of our lizard brain that Jesus acknowledged in the wilderness of temptation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Thank you. So I guess they could go into the second part of that question, why the backlash? And I think you explained it. You know, if you acknowledge it, then there's going to be some things you have to do without. But I believe that's part of what Jesus taught, you know, and to be a follower of Christ, you got to lose some things, you know. Okay, here's a question. Should Black people be the ones to teach white people about white privilege? Should Black people be the ones to teach white people about white privilege?
I think that that has to be the way it is, because we just don't get it on our own. I very much was like, I'm Laura Plaster, by the way. I'm very much like Brenda. I was a farm girl who would have never thought of myself as privileged, but now I didn't know. I thought it was more economical when we talked to privilege. When I learned that I was privileged, I felt very guilty. Mm. But I didn't learn of my white privilege until I met more and more people who were of color to teach me that. I had no idea. So I think we have to learn. White people have to learn from Black people, because otherwise we just don't get it. We don't understand it. Yeah. So I actually thank you all for the conversation.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for being here. I think when, you know, it goes back to relationships. I think when there is a relationship, you said you had friends who helped teach it, you know, to you. I think that matters. You don't ever want to be offensive to anyone, but at the same time, you want persons to be open, you know. And I think that's the problem a lot of times, because we build up a wall, you know, and anything, not just white privilege, but anything new that will cause us to change or think. I think we build up a wall until, and there's a barrier there. And again, but even I've had conversations with the persons with even just the mention of the fact that they may be white, and that's why, I mean, you know, so I think there has to be a safe space to have those conversations, absolutely. But I guess when you know better, you do better, but sometimes it's hard to get people to understand or to know. That's been my experience.
We all have blind spots, Stephanie.
Yes.
And we don't know the blind spots, and that's probably part of what the process of meditation and trying to see through the eyes of Christ is all about.
Yes.
Because we can't do it on our own, and we can't always expect other people to do these things for us. We have to have some spiritual awakening that only can come through seeing through the eyes of Christ, and that's why we are to meditate and pray, as well as listen to what other people say to us, and then to try to see the news, the society, the family life, the friendships, everything in the light of what is loving here.
Yeah. Amen. Thank you,
Stephanie. I want to just offer a slightly different perspective in that I hear what Laura is saying, but I think it's too much of a burden that we have to be taught by people of color. I think that it's my problem to learn about and deal with, and I grow so much from hearing your stories and gain so much insight from you and from my other friends who are people of color. but you're not responsible for teaching me about white privilege. I'm responsible to do that, find ways to learn on my own. But again, what a blessing to have relationships that can offer, can speed up my learning and my understandings about white privilege and how life has looked different to you and the ways in which not having white privilege has manifested itself through your story.
I agree. Thank you.
And Brenda, I appreciate that sort of clarification, because I agree it's not the total responsibility. It should be ours, to initiate that. So thank you for that.
Hey, Steph, obviously we need to spend some more time on this discussion, but it's the time we set for Ivy to introduce Reverend Love. So hang on.
Thank you, everyone.
Hang on to your thoughts, everybody, because we're going to have a lot more discussion next week. But let's go ahead if we could, because we don't want to take any time away from them.
Once again, Sharon Bowers didn't get to say anything.
Sharon Bowers, you're going to. Next week, we've got the whole time. We're going to give you a.
I'll wait till next time again, okay?
Thomas, we've not forgotten about you. So, Ivy, if you want to introduce Reverend Love, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi everybody. This is a real. It was so nice for Reverend Love to come and speak to us, because he is pretty big in the Baltimore, Washington conference. My whole thing here is a couple things. Who is he? Where did he come from? And why did I feel that he was so special enough to come and do this for us? He is this really isn't about me, but it's going to sound like, this is getting ready to sound like me. My favorite uncle in the world goes to church with his mom and dad. So that just says it right there. And every time I see him anywhere in the world, he just is one of those people, if you've met him once, you're a part of their family. And you know how when you meet somebody's mother, they just have that smile about them and they're the apple of their eye. I know this is so ridiculous, but I'm going to count on, since he's from the Baltimore, Washington jurisdiction, everybody that's here has already looked at his bio and knows that he is the assistant to one of the most wonderful bishops in the world, and he also is chair of Black Methodist for Church Renewal. So that's gone without saying. Why I mentioned my uncle is because Reverend Love comes from very humble beginnings, and as we talked initially about doing this, we both had to admit that we were very, very glad that we had parents that took enough time and money to educate us very well. And I think the biggest reason why, I think all of the above is why I thought that he would be great. One more thing I need to say. Where he came from in Maryland, when everybody thinks of the Baltimore, Washington corridor, they think of Baltimore, D.C., sidewalks, pavement. Reverend Love actually comes from an area very much like where you guys are. They grew tobacco. My cousins grew tobacco in the summertime. Just a very, very humble place. And He's worked very, very hard to be who he is. I'm sure that this is the first time that Reverend Love has ever been introduced like this. I'm sorry, but you're on.
He's fine.
Thanks, Bob.
Good evening to everyone, and thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity, certainly, to share with you this evening. I come with great appreciation, and I pray I might live up to half of what Sister Ivy has shared about me in her introduction. I want to share with you because we began our conversation with wanting to lay some foundation about certainly who Black Methodist for Church Renewal as an organization is. And so let me just start there, and then we'll move into a time of sharing in regards to certainly aspects of racism. Black Methodist for Church Renewal is one of the 5 racial ethnic caucuses that is recognized by the United Methodist Church. The other racial caucuses are our sisters and brothers who are the Native American, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, and certainly our Hispanic, Latinx brothers and sisters. BMCR, Black Methodist for Church Renewal, has its origins in the months that preceded the Uniting Conference in 1968 in Dallas, Texas. Black Methodists had been gathering to consider their hopes and dreams and concerns, as well as fears, of this new faith tradition that they were being to be an integral part of and a partner in its future. Now, it is important to note that Black Methodists were joining this new denomination, coming out of the racially segregated central jurisdiction at the insistence of the Evangelical Brethren Church, not the Methodist Church. If it had not been for the EUBs, Black Methodists may not have been embraced to come into this new thing God was going to do in 1968. So it was in 1967, Black Methodists were beginning to meet, to organize, to strategize about their future contributions, and to anticipate the outcomes of this merger, the Uniting Conference. When a name was decided upon by the group of leaders and preachers and theologians and members and other interested persons and concerned persons, they settled on Black Methodist for Church Renewal. Within its name, Black Methodists signaled their intent and desire to help this new denomination to engage in church renewal, an attempt to do better in the future than in the past, as people of faith who were moving towards being certainly God's community. The Reverend Jim Lawson, who was on the front lines of BMCR, the effort, spoke about BMCR and with a hope believed that one day BMCR would no longer be needed. Lawson said, and I quote, "Our hope is that Black Methodists for Church Renewal will soon be out of business. For years we have hungered, not only for the end of the central jurisdiction, but the end of segregation in all its forms, explicit and implicit. Perhaps now we can move in obedience to God's demand that we be one in life and ministry and work and structure, as well as in word. If Cincinnati," that was one of the places they met, "somehow enables us to see this need and to commit ourselves with courage to his task, God's task, then this conference will prove to be the most exciting and historic event in American Methodism." And yet, here we are in 2020, and Black Methodist for Church Renewal is still needed in the United Methodist Church because we have not yet achieved church renewal in its fullest sense. Even if we look at the founding documents of the United Methodist Church, I invite you to pay attention to paragraph 162 that speaks to racism and allows us to know that racism remains the unfinished work of our church. Black Methodist for Church Renewal is a caucus. It is a caucus committed to raising up prophetic voices that advocate for the unique needs of Black Methodists, persons, communities, and congregations. It is a caucus that has leadership at the general church level, jurisdictional, annual conference, and local church. It is the caucus that helped birth the General Commission on Religion and Race, the Commission on the Status and Role of Women, and helped desegregate the Methodist Publishing House. It is the cause that for it is the caucus that for every other caucus looks to and leans on as the forerunner in the efforts of racial justice and equity. For our conversation this evening, I know you have asked that we would share about racism as witnessed and faced in this United Methodist Church, our beloved United Methodist Church. And so at this time, we will begin to share. I say we because the vice chair of Black Methodists for Church Renewal, Deborah Bass, is on with me. And I'm going to ask Deborah if she would share some stories, and then I will share some stories, and then we will enter into conversation. Deborah.
Thank you, Reverend Tony. Good evening. And I too want to thank you for the invitation to engage with this group as you continue your journey with sacred conversations on the issue of racism. I am Deborah Bass, and I am a native of Southern California, but I'm a third generation United Methodist who's had the opportunity to travel around the world as a staff person of the General Board of Global Ministries when it was located in New York. But before I relocated to New York to work for the board, I made a commitment to giving back to my community when I finished college. So I became a church-based community organizer working at First United Methodist Church in the city I grew up in Compton, California. Now, this was in the 70s, late 70s and early 80s, and the community was experiencing white flight. Also, the church in the community was experiencing the same. My task was to look at ways we could work with coalitions in the community around the issue of affordable housing. And since there were so many vacant properties, to determine how local residents could purchase the houses. We investigated, and it was determined that Bank of America had bought up most of the houses in the community surrounding the church, but they were practicing redlining and not allowing Black families in the community to buy the homes. This was my first experience with institutional racism. We partnered with Legal Aid and a couple of foundations to file a lawsuit against B of A. We sent Black families to apply for loans, all with good credit and a good down payment, and to apply for a mortgage. And then we sent white couples in with the same credit and assets in to apply for a mortgage. And in every instance, the Black families were denied and the white family was approved. We had enough documented cases to file a lawsuit against Bank of America. And because we were a large enough coalition of organizations, we won a landmark case that proved that B of A was purposely discriminating against Blacks in their lending practices. It changed the narrative on how loans were administered and became a template for language in the fair housing legislation in California. So following that 5-year period as a community organizer, I was asked to come to New York to work for the General Board of Global Ministries. Now you have to know I'm born and bred in Southern California, so winter was not my favorite in any form or fashion because I was used to warm weather all year round. But I was made a compelling offer, and so I went. I was sent all over the United States and around the world as I worked in the national division and also worked with the world division. And one particular incident will always remain in my spirit that happened in the early 90s when I was asked to lead a team that was working in a small rural town 60 miles outside of Jackson, Mississippi, to deal with racial reconciliation. I was leading a team of interracial members who were from Mississippi and from the Board of Global Ministries. We were meeting with a local team that wanted to begin working together on some community-based mission projects to assist with eradicating poverty and improve healthcare and education in a Black community. It was in the 90s and the churches were segregated, but there had been some efforts to work together on some common issues led by the white superintendent of the area. It was my first time working in the Deep South, and we were told when we got there that there were some folks in the community that did not want this project to work. So there were some ground rules that we needed to understand and make sure that we followed. Number one was don't stay in town after dark. Don't go to the small country stores that were located in a particular part of the city, and do not visit some of the remaining working plantations. As you can imagine, this made for a challenging environment to work with local church members who were trying to work together on some basic human rights and justice issues. We worked out of a small Black church in the area, and the white superintendent and the pastor of the white church had agreed that we would meet at First Church for our final meeting to bring the recommendations that the group had worked on to the district committee to be funded in part by Global Ministries and the conference. We had worked in Mississippi for over a month, driving back and forth from Jackson daily, and we were excited about the progress and the project that the folks had embarked on when I got a call the evening before we were to make a presentation to the district committee from the DS who said he needed to see me the next morning before the meeting. The next day, me and a colleague drove to the site to meet him at his house to discuss this urgent matter. We arrived to find the DS and the lay leader and head of the trustees of the white church we were to meet at sitting on the front porch waiting for us. The DS asked his wife to serve us all sweet tea. She reluctantly did, and then we were told that the meeting we were to have the next day at First Church was not going to happen because the trustees were not going to allow Blacks in the church, and they had an emergency meeting with the administrative council to block it. I thought we had made good progress, but agreed that we would spend the remainder of the day calling all of the members of the coalition to tell them that we were going to have the meeting at the Black church. I was disappointed, but I realized that change in race relations takes time, and although the whites and Blacks in the coalition were ready to make changes in how they work together, it was going to take more time of them working together and building relationships with one another for them to develop trust. But the thing that left a lasting impression was when the DS's wife came out to pick up the tray of glasses right in front of us. She picked up our glasses with gloves on and said to us that they were going in the trash. Much to the chagrin of her husband and the other men sitting on the porch, he apologized profusely, but it helped me to understand that some feelings run very, very deep. My last story I will share with you is about a team I was leading in Mozambique in Africa. When you visit mission sites in other countries, no matter how poorly the conditions seem to us from the Western Hemisphere, our partners in mission welcome us with open arms and give their guests the best that they have to offer. Now, during orientation, and we spent 3 days in the States on orientation, and then when we got to Africa, we spent another whole day in orientation to try to help folks acclimate to where they were and what to expect when we went out into the rural areas. But I had a woman in the group I was leading who became the ugly American and acted out her privilege in a very ugly way while we were visiting a mission orphanage. She asked inappropriate questions, belittled the orphanage conditions and its staff, talked loudly over the Portuguese translator. She refused to eat with us and proceeded to say that she felt that the place was not clean enough for her to eat anything very loudly. I pulled her aside and reminded her of our orientation and role playing and asked her not to continue expressing her opinion and being the ugly American. She told me because I was the N-word, whose ancestors had come from Africa, I was probably used to conditions like we were seeing on the trip. But when I picked my tongue up off the floor, I told her that this mission trip was probably not appropriate for her, and that when we got back to the hotel, I would arrange for her to return home. Some of her colleagues heard the exchange and had a meeting with her. and told her that she was showing her privilege and that she was missing the point of the mission encounter of the trip. She came to my room with a part of the team that confronted her and apologized for her words to me and for acting out and asked me not to send her home. I was tempted not to accept the apology, but I did. And with the continued prompting of the team member, she behaved the rest of the trip. Some years later, and I believe it was at General Conference, we saw each other and she apologized again for using the N-word and behaving so badly in that setting. She came to me and said that, I've learned a lot since those years when I went to Mozambique, and I hope you will understand that I have changed. Tony?
Thank you, Deborah. Just briefly, I want to share one or two stories, and then we'll certainly engage in the conversation, question and answers. I want to bring this understanding of racism even closer in time. Prior to becoming the assistant to Bishop Latrell Miller Easterling, I served as the director of what we called Vibrant Communities. It is our Office of Congregational Development. And I want to share with you that when I arrived to this position, I asked each district superintendent that I might have a day on the district to ride with them and to tour their districts, that I might be able to see the places where there was population growth and places where we might consider planting churches, or some places where we needed to consider what revitalization would look like. Understand, I held that position from 2014 to 2017. One of the district superintendents, while we were out spending a day together, had to remind me as we were driving through a particular town. He said, "Now, let me tell you, Tony, is that this town, you will need to be out of it before dark. You need to always know that. You need to understand that you will need to be outside of this town before evening would fall." And to be a member of the Baltimore-Washington Conference in certainly the Northeast jurisdiction, where often the Baltimore-Washington Conference is looked at as one of our diverse, inclusive conferences, to have to realize that just a few years ago, I was still having to face, as an African-American male, the reality that there are places where I'm not safe, I'm not wanted, I am not invited to be, certainly after dark. So I share that with you. And then also recently, as an extended cabinet, we've been doing some work around understanding racism and privilege. And I was engaged in conversation with one of my colleagues, and he was sharing a recent story of how he and one of our conference staff recently had visited a town. They'd gone to a town because they were there to do some preliminary work around a church closure. So the colleague who I'm engaging with is Caucasian. The staff person who had gone with him was an African-American male. They had gone into this town. They had visited the church that was seeking to close. They met on the grounds. After that, before they were going to meet with the church leadership, they had some time to walk the town. They had lunch in the town, had set out, letting time just pass before they were meeting with the church leaders in the church. My colleague shared with me that when they arrived at the church and sat down for the meeting, those church folk who had come began to share that they had known that they had been in town. They had known the spots they had visited. They knew where they had had lunch. I just invite you to think about that and to think about, what does that mean? That I suspect that the African-American in the company of the Caucasian became the one who was being watched, and that we still have towns where persons are watching and calling and reporting on people of color, to the point that the church folk could arrive to a meeting and share all of that with these two from the conference who had come in, certainly to do our conference work. Last thing I share with you is a conversation that Deborah and I were part of last week. We were sitting in the meeting of the Interethnic Strategic Development Group. It is a group that has representation from all 5 racial ethnic caucuses, as well as leadership from the national plans of caucuses at the general church level. And it broke my heart to hear one of the caucuses having to share that as we look to the future of the United Methodist Church and all that looms out there, and that despite our acts of repentance and despite our desires, they do not believe that in the future that there's a place for these siblings to move forward, because there's not enough evidence that we have moved forward significantly. We have not made great strides enough. And that broke my heart, that we would actually have siblings, brothers and sisters of a caucus, people of color, of a racial ethnic caucus that feel in 2020 that this United Methodist Church, birthed in '68, with a promise that it was going to do all it could to eradicate and work on racism, don't find a place at the table and might actually be considering leaving the table. And so I just share those stories with you. And again, Deborah and I thank you for the opportunity to be with you this evening and for the opportunities for us to engage in conversation. We are grateful for the work that you're doing, and we pray for what you're doing, that it's going to yield many, many blessings, that God's kingdom certainly may come fully here on earth as it is in heaven. So we turn ourselves back into the hands of our host, and we stand ready to engage in any questions that may be asked, or however it is that we might move forward. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you both so much. You've given us a lot to think about, and I hope everybody heard every word that you both shared with us. And I think for the sake of time, what we'll do, Celia Ferguson is going to do so. She's going to facilitate because we certainly want to have time for people to ask questions of all three of you. But let's go ahead and let Bishop Carter speak. And then we will have plenty of time after that to engage in conversation with you, Reverend Love, Miss Bass, and with Bishop Carter. Does that sound okay with everyone? And if you have questions too, please feel free to put them in the chat. Celia is monitoring that. So feel free, if you want to write something in the chat, a question for anyone. And I'll turn it over now to Pat Clendenin, and she's going to introduce Bishop Carter.
Thanks, Pat. It's an honor and a privilege to be introducing Bishop Kenneth Carter, a son of Holston Conference, and known and loved by many of you, as evidenced by your presence here tonight. He is a native of Johnson City and served congregations in Holston for 32 years. And while serving at Church Street in Knoxville in 1992, he was elected to the episcopacy and assigned to the Nashville area and subsequently to the Mississippi area. The Mississippi Conference presented him with the Drum Major for Justice Award, and the state legislature honored him for his work on behalf of racial and economic justice. His life and ministry have been marked by presence with and passion for those who live on the margins of society, including the poor, the imprisoned, the homeless, and those who live with dementia. He was caregiver for his wife of 59 years, Linda, until her death from dementia in October 2019. Aware that this month is the first anniversary of Linda's death and is a poignant time for you, Ken, we surround you and your family with our love and prayers, and with the hope that the memories you share will bring peace and hope and joy. I was blessed to serve with Ken at Church Street, as well as under his Episcopal leadership in both the Tennessee and Memphis conferences. As I have told many over the years, his mentoring was like a refiner's fire, shaping me and my approaches to ministry in ways that have continued to impact my ministry to this day. When he was elected bishop, he shared with some of us that one of the things he would miss the most was losing his first name. Well, not tonight. Welcome home, Ken.
Well, thank you, Pat. And it is indeed an honor and a privilege to be with you. So thanks for the invitation, and thank you for what you are doing. Many of you know my friend Peter Story. Peter Story was involved in the formation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, a friend of Desmond Tutu. And we were colleagues at Duke, but I did one of my Episcopal visits was in South Africa and Zimbabwe, where I spent significant time with Peter. But I asked Peter a few years ago if he had any regrets about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission or any suggestions that he had learned, things he had learned from that process. And he said, where we failed in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the failure to get it down to the local level, that the Truth and Reconciliation took place at the governmental level, and it was important to do that. But he said we didn't follow up and get that down into local communities where they needed to engage in truth and reconciliation process. And I would suggest that that's what we're doing here. These kinds of conversations are opportunities to tell the truth and to be reconciled. And we'll talk a little about that, but I commend you for what you are doing and consider it an honor to share in the process. Well, let me give you just a little bit. I'm going to be more confessional. I've said to others who, when I've been invited to participate in similar activities, I think we white folks need to do an awful lot of listening right now. And therefore I'm more interested in listening than I am talking. But I do want to share with you where I'm coming from. I grew up in Washington County, Tennessee. When Brenda Carroll was sharing a while ago, I identified we were sharecroppers and tenant farmers, and my father was a textile mill worker. We were among the poor whites in the Washington County, Johnson City area. And as many of you know, that region, there were at that time, this was I was born in 1940. You do the calculations now. But at that time, there were very, very few African Americans in Johnson City, a very distinct minority. And I went to segregated schools. I lived in segregated communities. My early life was formed in segregation. The first African-American friend I had was in seminary, and I'll tell you about him in a few moments. I remember the fountains for whites. I remember the lunch counter at the Crest department store in Johnson City. I grew up in that kind of context. And we, being among the poor whites, I learned later my father would never admit it. And that's another indication of white privilege. In fact, I was suggesting that our resistance to white privilege is evidence of our white privilege. And the best use of our white privilege is to dismantle it. And that's what we are about, I think. But in that community, in that culture in which I grew up, even though we were white, and maybe some considered us white trash, we were at least better than. And that, therefore, white supremacy was ingrained in me from the very beginning, simply because of the culture, not because my parents or family said so. It was just the way it felt. We were superior. And of course, politicians have played on that all these years and are still doing it, pitting the working class, poor whites against the blacks. And we're seeing evidences of that at the highest level in our government now. But my first, when I went to seminary, I went to seminary in Washington, D.C. I enrolled at Wesley Seminary in 1962, and Tony knows this well, that region very well, and Deborah. And I was appointed as a student pastor. I was appointed to the Hunting Hill McDonald Chapel Charge in Montgomery County, near Gaithersburg on Darnestown Road. And the history that Pete shared with you last night, I was immediately confronted with. The Hunting Hill Church was the former ME Church. The McDonald Chapel was the former ME Church South. They were 2 miles apart on the same road. Located between those two was Pleasant View Methodist Church, a part of the central jurisdiction. So right there in the distance of 2 miles was the history of the segregation in the Methodist Church at the time. And I was appointed to the 2 white congregations. Well, one day as I was driving up the road, I saw a car parked in the parking lot at Pleasant View. So I thought this might be a good chance to meet the pastor. So I stopped, and sure enough, the pastor, Tom Barrington, was there. And we struck up a conversation. I was met with great warmth and hospitality, and he and I became friends. He became my first African-American friend and colleague. But it was also at that time that I first met institutional systemic racism. Tom was 55 or 56 years old. I was 23 to 25 while I was there. He was a seminary graduate. I was a seminary student. I was part-time. He was full-time. He had another church, and my salary was $300 more per year than his. So I first was introduced to institutional racism there. And through our relationship and friendship, we began having groups in the 3 churches. It started with a scout troop. We started having groups meet together. And now on Darnestown Road, there is a church, multiracial. Tony knows it, and probably Deborah knows it. The Fairhaven United Methodist Church has about 50% African American and Asian, I believe. And I zoomed in on their homecoming this year and was delighted. Well, there I learned the importance of relationships, that how relationships began to, here I have been this white from East Tennessee, and now I am introduced to and became acquainted with the African Americans in that congregation, and particularly with Tom. And at this time, the African American students were coming on campus at Wesley Seminary, and some of them would come into class on Tuesday morning, having spent the weekend in jail because they had been engaging in civil disobedience over on the eastern shore of Maryland. So I was introduced to both the struggle to overcome racism, and I was very much aware of my own privilege. So let me just say that having been involved in the Methodist Church and United Methodist Church at all levels, from the local congregation through being an active bishop, I have observed racism at every level, and it is at every level. In the congregations, as a pastor, I served segregated congregations, all white congregations, with very few exceptions of where there might have been a few African Americans present. So that's an evidence. Our segregated congregations are evidences of the racism that still exists. And how did I do enough to help overcoming that? I admit, I was not intentional about overcoming the barriers and reaching beyond the white communities that I served. However, I did based on my relationship with Tom, I did reach out to make friends with those across the racial lines. And I recall Pete was mentioning some of these last night. I recall Amos Holmes, Raymond White, E.O. Cole, Paul Marchbanks, Walter Willis. Those were mentioned last night. But in every community I served, I also tried to become acquainted with the AME, the AMEZ, and the CME pastors that shared that community with me. And also to create in the congregations some possibilities and opportunities for cross-racial experiences. At the annual conference level in Holston Conference, I experienced the racism and participated in it. See, I'm the beneficiary of the white privilege and the racism. For example, I served as the chair of church extension, is it what it's called, church extension and parish development for my 1984 to 1992. And there we developed the Builders Club to raise money to build new churches. The goal was to plant new churches, quote, where the people are. But in reality, if I'm honest, it was where certain people are. We were acquiescing to the white flight. We were acquiescing to the housing patterns and the racism of our culture. So I was not only at the conference level helping to fund those, and we established churches, and you're establishing another one in the suburbs, I understand there. I'm not criticizing that, but I wish I had, as the chair of the committee, I wish I had raised questions about, well, what do we really mean by church extension? What does church extension mean? Does it mean to extend the church's justice ministries, its inclusive ministries, its, welcome to all people? Or are we only talking about membership and numbers? And what impact does the establishing of new churches in the suburbs, what impact is that having on Lenoncini or on Magnolia Avenue or those churches in the inner city, rather than struggling with that? And I think the failure to struggle with that is an example of racism, of institutional racism. How do you keep people together? Now, as a bishop, I did serve as Pat said, in the Nashville area and in Mississippi. And Deborah, when were you in Mississippi? Was it? I think
it was before you got there.
I was going to say I didn't remember.
No. It was way before you got there. Yeah.
But some of the same problems existed while I was there. But Brenda, you reminded me of the story when I was received into Mississippi at that worship service where they welcomed the new bishop. In the sermon I delivered, I shared with them my background. I said I grew up in East Tennessee, that I was formed in racism and was formed in white privilege, but I don't want to be racist. I consider racism a sin. So I'm asking you, I'm inviting you, if you detect racism or when you detect it in me, I would invite you to confront me with it. Tell me about it. Now, I would prefer that you do it personally, privately first, but if that doesn't work, go ahead and embarrass me, because I'd rather lose face than to lose my soul. Well, one of the district superintendents, African-American, came to me afterward and said, "Bishop, do you really mean what you said?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Well, you probably, it's going to take a while for us to trust that." I appreciated that honesty. There is a power differential after all, you know. And then he said to me, Brenda, what you commented earlier. He said, "Bishop, I really do appreciate your openness to addressing that, but please don't make us responsible for curing your racism. we've got too much burden otherwise. We have enough load to carry without putting that on us. But he did come to me from time to time and be able to say, now, Bishop, you may not have meant it this way, but this is how we heard that. Okay. Now, I want to say one final thing before we get into a discussion. Is my time about up, isn't it? Somebody keeping time? Cut me off. One of the things that I think has, one of the things that I experienced in Mississippi is you remember we repented of our racism in the 2000 General Conference. I went back home to Nashville before I moved from Nashville to Mississippi, and my friend Will Campbell, many of you know Will Campbell by reputation, wrote Brother to a Dragonfly, was very active in anti-racism. But Will Campbell said, so I noticed, Ken, you Methodists have repented of your racism. He said, you know, your denomination's repenting of racism is like an intoxicated man going down the street, pushing people into the traffic and said, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Excuse me, I'm sorry. If you're going to repent of your racism, stop pushing people into the street. Well, I needed to hear that. When I went to Mississippi, we had that service of repentance of the racism in Mississippi. And I remembered one of the AME bishops said at the General Conference, we are fruit inspectors. We're going to inspect the fruits of your repentance. But what I experienced in Mississippi, at the conference level, there was great inclusiveness in the leadership of the conference. But there was not, we hadn't moved, we had assumed, or there was the assumption that inclusion means reconciliation, when it doesn't. In other words, I think reconciliation without justice is cheap reconciliation. Just like cheap grace, you can have cheap reconciliation. So what we did, we went to various locations in Mississippi, centers of the civil rights era, and we had pilgrimages where we confessed, repented, and began to find ways, how can we establish justice in these situations. So I think that's enough from me right now. Have I gone over time?
Ken, you're just right on time.
I'd love to discuss more. As Tony and Deborah and I, I'm sure we'd love to discuss as much as we possibly can.
Well, thank you, Ken and Tony and Deborah, for sharing with us your passion, your insights, your challenges for our thinking and for our discussion right now. I don't see in the chat any specific questions to you all. So I'm just going to ask, does anyone in the group have a question or comment that you would like to direct to any of our speakers, either Ken or Tony or Deborah? I'll take the liberty of using everybody's first name.
Please do, mine.
Is there anybody who would like to venture a question or a comment?
I have a question.
Who is that? Who is
Barbara,
that?
Barbara. I'm familiar with the answer, but I would just like to hear what they think about it. Deborah and Tony and Bishop. I know Deborah said something about it. Why do you think they always fall back on the N word when it comes time for confrontation?
I think that when folks get frightened or threatened, sometimes people fall back on some things that are in their past. And so it comes out. I think as an African-American woman, I have begun to understand that there's a lot of insecurity. And so I need to, so when somebody does that, they're trying to put me in a box and in my place. And what I learned over the years is you can't put me in a box. You can't put me in a place. And so I don't get, when I was in my 30s, my anger would come up and I would be combative. But I understand that when privilege or someone is challenged with their white privilege, they're fighting back. And sometimes it comes out in the form of trying to make me feel less than what I am. And so, and that's just a learning that has come over the years for me.
I think I would add to the conversation two things. One would be that the use of the N word, I would say, comes from the place of hurt people hurt people.
Mm-hmm.
And I would add to that that the use of the word certainly is meant to inflict pain and hurt. And when persons don't have the ability to argue with you or stand toe-to-toe with you on any other grounds, it then leads to the lowest common denominator of conversation you can have, which is just name calling. And I think actually it stems from a place of, I have nothing better I can offer to this conversation. So all I can do is name call. And so I think we have to be willing to rise above that when called names, because it really speaks to the fact that the person using it has no other platform, no other space to occupy to be engaging of you. And so it is to choose to just name call, and it comes from a person who is hurt, seeking to inflict pain.
I think it also is, it's a form of dehumanizing. And whenever we're threatened, we go against those that are threatening us, and it may be a perceived threat, but it's the first step is to dehumanize them, to make them less than we are. And it comes out, I agree, it comes out of a hurt and inflicts hurt.
Thank you. Those are such compassionate and generous ways of trying to really put some understanding to what's going on with that other person. And I think being able to do that comes whenever we've had lots of years under our belts and lots of willingness to empathize and see from another's perspective. And oftentimes we're faced with someone who is not able and willing to do that. Thank you each for your response to that.
If I could say one other word, Cindy, where I have run into it, I have been serving as the volunteer chaplain in a memory unit where Linda was at one time. And to be sensitive, see, most of the CNAs and nursing assistants are African American. Most of the people who are residents are white. And the N-word is often used by the whites because their boundaries their filters are gone with their dementia. And the pastoral need to care for those CNAs, in that process. It's just to be sensitive to those earlier years that racism does come out when the filters are gone. And sometimes I think people blurt out the N-word because their filter, they suddenly don't have the filter. In other words, it's not, it's not it was the word used in my childhood in East Tennessee, but it's now not the accepted word to be used unless your filter's gone. But the feeling may still be there.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So we have a question. I want to know how have people of color put up with us, white people? Anybody want to take that question? How have people of color put up with us, white people?
Great question.
Thank you.
Two things come to mind in certainly providing a response. One is to just point out the historical reality. Because Caucasians have been privileged and have been the dominant privileged culture, other persons of color have had to put up with it. It was a reality to survive. It was a reality to make some gains, that if there is a privileged group of persons, or there's a set of persons or class of persons or race of persons who are the haves, and you're seeking to make an existence and live, you just have to put up with. And so just out of the nature of survival,
yeah,
it becomes this is what we will do to make it. This is what we'll do with a hope and a prayer there's a better day coming. This is what we need to do or will do. Because that's just the present context and reality of life. The other thing I think that particularly within America, for people of color, particularly for African Americans who, as was shared early on, for enslaved people who came here who were given Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
There is in many people of color just a belief and a hope that there is something greater coming, and we hold on to that. So we struggle, we put up with the strife, but we're holding on to the fact that there has been a promise made in this faith journey that this Jesus is a deliverer, that this Jesus has a better place, that there is a reckoning day coming, and in that day, all of the hurt and harms will be passed away. And so I think people of color do have a lens by which they have put up with, because there is a foundation of faith or an affirmation of faith that looks to the greater that is coming.
I think the other thing is you can ask any African American. We live two lives. We live a life that is Black, that is that you experience in your community, in your home, and then you're always taught early on that you have to do better, you have to excel, and you have to live in a white world. And so you grew up with that, knowing that you had to achieve more, you had to excel. And so it was ingrained in you that there were certain things that you were going to have to put up with when you were outside of the safety of that community or that home. And so especially for baby boomers, that is just something that it was just ingrained in us throughout our growing up and in our lives.
Those are both of you have given us responses that speak of a hope, but also something that seems to me takes huge amount of energy. I mean,
yes, it does.
Be exhausting.
It is
exhausting, and I don't think we white people have any clue how exhausting it is.
That's true. That's true. It is very exhausting, and when you see injustices over and over and over again, it does trigger something in you. And so I think, as Tony has said, our faith journey, for those of us who are Christians, our faith journey helps us to get through that, because there is this hope. The friends I have that are agnostic or atheists, I worry about them because they don't have a belief in anything higher. And so for them, this is the world that they're seeing. And all they're seeing is the injustice. And so they don't have that same sense of hope. And so there's always a greater struggle, a greater temptation to be in depression, and also to not feel well about what's happening.
I'm so sorry.
That's all right. That's all right.
I had all that turned off.
I assure you that happens to all of us.
Yes, it has. It has. Yes.
It's our granddaughter. She often calls at this time. And
at this time, yeah.
Oh, I'm
may
sorry.
May I ask, perhaps Tony and Deborah and others, how would you? Well, I'm not even sure how to ask the question, but I'm just, Araceli, what you just said about how exhausting it can be. How can we, as whites who are privileged, are there ways that we can support you in overcoming that or relieving the pressure? I guess I'm trying to see, is there a way that we who are privileged can get beyond that privilege in such a way that we might relieve you of some of that stress?
Like use our privilege for that purpose of support.
I think it's what you're doing. It's building relationships. It's listening to one another. It's having honest conversation and hearing, and really listening to what your sisters and brothers are saying. It is very, very hard to walk in another person's shoes. And Bishop, you know this from all your years from traveling all over the world. You have to, every time we'd go outside the United States, the one thing that we understood was that we were Americans, and we had to slow down and build relationships before you could even talk about what you wanted to do. And for me, that's important. And I think this group, there are several other groups around the country who are having courageous conversations to begin to understand what their sisters and brothers who are not white live through on a daily basis. I think the other thing is just having allies in the struggle, to know that there are folks that are, even if you don't necessarily understand it, is that someone that says to you, I'm praying for you. I am really wanting to understand better what it is that I can do in the struggle also. And I think for a lot of folks, it's, as I said to the cabinet here in Calpac, even if you don't have African-American pastors on your district, or you have them and they're in cross-racial appointments, one of the things I said to them is check in with because there are things that do trigger a response from African-Americans. So just check in. How are you doing? Is it well with your soul today? I think that's very important, just to check in with African-Americans and help them and just say, I don't necessarily understand what's happening. I don't understand your struggles, but I am praying for you. I am supportive of you in any way that I can be. And I just want to make sure you know that I care about you and your soul.
Thank
Bishop, this is Sharon Bowers. You asked that question and you ask it for everyone. So I wanted to weigh in on that. One of the things that I think is real important for white people to start processing their alleged white privilege. And by that, I simply mean to live in and stay with that privilege. And is it really privilege? Ask the kinds of questions. is this really privilege or is this entitlement? And there is a difference between privilege and entitlement. And so I think it's the language that we use that sometimes when we do say things like white privilege, it still remains a banner for us that we continue to use. And so one of the places that I think white people can start in the deconstruction is to deconstruct the concept of white privilege, because white privilege reinforces what you say or you're trying to stop doing. So I think language, since language is a task of world building, one of the first places that white people can start is to live into the concept of white privilege and start there with the deconstruction.
Thank you.
Good point.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you. So we have about 4 more minutes for our discussion time. And we've had a couple of other questions in the chat, one of which is a question for each of the 3 of you presenters. So maybe this could be very brief on each of your parts. From your perspective, can you talk about how reconciliation in the United Methodist Church, how would that look? What would that look like? This person also mentioned also the issue of how segregated our churches are, or how do we desegregate? Do you have any thoughts about reconciliation and what that might look like within our United Methodist Church? It's hard to even think about that to do briefly, right?
It is. It is.
It really is. It really is. A bishop said it. I remember being at a general conference when we did the Acts of Repentance. We do a lot of things that and we're very sincere in it, but it doesn't really mean anything. And so reconciliation is difficult. The Sunday mornings are still very segregated. And so it is building those relationships. I know we're having discussions now in CalPAC about racism, and we're also dealing with how do you strengthen churches. And one of the things our bishop said to us, I understand that there are Black churches, there are Hispanic churches, there are Asian churches, and there are white churches. He said, but in the beloved community, one would hope that at some day we would not have to be able to say that there would be churches where everybody is invited and feel welcome. I think that's going to take a while. Especially as you look at our United Methodist Church in the United States. But it does mean, because the generation behind us came behind me, millennials and others don't think in terms of race. But they are no longer in our churches in a lot of places. And so they don't see race the same as those of us who were baby boomers. And so they see that beloved community and would like to engage in that in a church. And we've not been intentional in a lot of places about letting that happen.
I think it would mean hearing each other's stories and receiving each other's gifts.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Deborah. Tony, do you want to speak a moment? Or?
Yeah, I'm wrestling with it. Certainly, when I think about reconciliation, I certainly don't see it as an act, as a simple event that occurs and we think we're done with the work. I think reconciliation comes when it would look like this to me. It would be everyone being able to sit at the table, and whatever's on the table, everybody has access to.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I like that image. That's a beautiful image. That's a wonderful note to end our discussion on. Thank you so much, each of you, for
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your energy and your visions and your faith with us tonight. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. And at this moment, Jean Gallion is going to talk with us about our plans for next Tuesday night. And then we will have a brief closing worship.
And Jean's computer has frozen, and she tried to turn it off and it wouldn't even let her turn it off. So she's having a little bit of a technical problem. So I'm just going to quickly say that thank you again to echo Celia's words. This is what we need to be doing: talking, listening, sharing, and we will continue to do that next week. I won't go into a lot of detail because Pat Clenden's going to close us with a very brief worship service, but I'll send some things out in an email. But basically next week, we'd like to talk about how to have these conversations and what to do if you see racist behavior, if somebody tells a racist joke. We want to have a discussion amongst ourselves of some things that we can do, maybe some things that we can say. I know in my breakout room last week, the main thing that was said was by white people was they don't know what to do. They simply don't know what to do if they hear or see something. So we're going to talk about that next week. Sharon Bowers is going to tell her story for sure. We're going to do that since she didn't get to last week. And we'll just engage in some more conversations. So I hope that will be good. I hope you'll come back next week. And I'm going to turn it over to Pat now and let her close us out. And thank you again.
Thanks, Pat. Well, we've been given much to think about tonight. Let us enter into a spirit of worship led by the voice of a child, singing an adaptation of the prayer of St. Francis.
Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, only light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. Oh, Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, in giving of ourselves that we receive, and in dying that we're born to eternal life. Oh, Master, grant that I may never seek so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you.
I would like to share with you 2 quotes for reflection over this next week until we come back together again next Tuesday evening. The first comes from Frederick Buechner in his book, Beyond Words. Compassion is the sometimes fatal capacity for living in someone's skin. It is the knowledge that there can never really be any peace and joy for me unless there is peace and joy finally for you too. And the second one comes from the Dalai Lama. The cultivation of compassion is no longer a luxury, but a necessity if our species is to survive. Now, I'm going to invite you to join me in our closing prayer, which Donna will be putting up on the screen so that all of us may pray together. Let us pray. Trusting your lead, let me be drawn into compassion. For in abandoning
fear,
putting
myself aside,
I enter
a place I long for,
alongside
the brokenhearted,
and
whisper
where one
another's burden.
Am I ready
to give what compassion asks of me?
Am I willing
to stop observing and step in? Am I ready
to stop standing in silence and instead use your hands and heart? There are victims of injustice, and there is hurting, grieving world that needs disciples and followers, not just believers. You challenge and comfort me and increase my faith in your saving presence. Give me a measure of strength and courage to enter the deep waters of another's pain. Help me put aside my own wounds and anxieties and reach out to those who need love the most. Open my heart to your healing and light, and let me enter into compassion. Amen. Go in peace, dear friends, and we look forward to being together again next Tuesday evening.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.